You can actually sit this side, so you can sit this side if you like. It's okay. Going against the Catholicity of the experience, and so on. But it is possible for the same movement to grow, as we see in the Oriental space, that the entire movement of expansion did not involve a disruption because it followed nature's principle to preserve the wholeness without losing the concentration, allowing a slow diffusion of many different forms, types, and variations. And particularly, as we see in India, the original intuition of religion and the total movement of evolutionary nature was allowed a free flow. There was no limitation of one creed or dogma, any number of different formulations allowed to grow, and nothing is banned, nothing is cut out. There is an acceptance of every possible variation. Even occultism is pushed to its maximum limits, spiritual philosophies of all kinds, in exploring every extreme, as well as spiritual experience and self discipline, taking all the different possibilities. And so one has naturally an image of what you see in a rainforest, where the ecosystem has not been interfered with, and the spontaneous growth makes for everything from grass through shrubs to mid-level plants to tall trees, narrow height, broad wide but short height, and every variation in between. And then you have creepers climbing along the trunk of a large tree, and the trunk is supporting the creeper, and the creeper is filling in gaps where the trunk could not grow leaves. And in this way, there's a very rich mix and interchange and nourishment from each of these specialized lines. Everything supports everything else. Coming into it, your first glimpse is what appears to be almost chaotic. But looking at it with a more sensitive eye, you see that nature is trying to fill every gap and develop every opportunity in forms and types. And so, in this, he says, its method has been the method of evolutionary nature herself to allow all developments, all means of communication and action of the spirit upon the members, all ways of communion between man, every possible way of advance to the goal, and test even to its extreme. And of course, there are many kinds of test, but the test which is the most important is the test of time. We look back and we see so many different specialized traditions did not survive. And those which did remain as sufficiently large or sufficiently plastic and therefore able to survive. And we'll see something of this a little further on. What is the requirement for survival in the long run? But the important idea, he says, is All stages of spiritual evolution are there in man, and each has to be allowed and provided with its means of approach to the spirit, an approach suited to its capacity, adhikara. So, this large picture, which you see in a large, complex society, is actually a reflection of what is happening within us. That within the human type, let's say generally, all of these stages of spiritual evolution are already there. What we saw earlier as stage one, stage two, stage three, or different levels of consciousness which are being dealt with, different parts of our nature which have their own requirement and represent different possibilities in the spiritual evolution. All this which we see in the large mix of society is really a reflection in a collective space of something which is in the human type itself. And therefore, he says, each has to be allowed and provided with its means of approach to the spirit and approach suited to its capacity. When the will wants to submit itself, its capacity is only so much. It cannot, for example, of its own, aim at a total identification. It starts with a sense of separation. I will serve an ideal, and wants to translate the ideal by representing into its understanding what it sees. And that's your starting point. Someone else may have a higher development, or the whole movement of the whole nature might be much more refined and brought close through bhakti towards an identification and immersion where there is no sense of I doing, and there is only the self giving and emerging in the flow of the action. And that also has to have its space. It creates certain problems, which we will see later in the next paragraph in some detail. But one example of the problem will be one type, which is still quite crude, might be sitting right next to another type, which is highly developed. And they may be speaking even similar words, but meaning something totally different. And how do you distinguish which is genuine, which is wrong? And this people face. So many people come to India for what may be called spiritual tourism. So they will go to sacred spaces. Rishikesh is one popular one. And you step into that space and you have literally hundreds of boards of yoga classes and all kinds of things. And there are certain restaurants which are more liked by certain types of visitors, particularly from the West. And you'll see there's a bulletin board, and I once took a photograph. It will be interesting to look at it again. Literally 40 or 50 different slips of every kind of tradition, every kind of practice, every kind of specialization, and combinations thereof. And it's all there. What do you do? How do you choose? Which is genuine, which is not? Well, you can't. Not at least by looking at the name board. Perhaps by meeting people, perhaps by having first interactions, or if you have already an intuition. And perhaps if you're an intuition, then you might avoid those labels in the first place and go to something else, or the intuition would have led you to something more deep. And it's very difficult to recognize what it is until there is a deeper inner recognition. And yet, there is something for everyone. And I'll put it another way, if that entire complex ecosystem is still thriving after so many decades, it means that each of those little slips of paper is getting its client. And so the person who's offering that service is satisfied, and the person who needs that service is satisfied. But one could sit next to the other, and you wouldn't know which is deeper or which is more superficial. But this is how it is in society. So all stages of spiritual evolution are there in man, and each has to be provided for. Even the primitive forms that survived were not banned, but were lifted to a deeper significance. While still there was the pressure of the highest spiritual pinnacles in the rarest supreme ether. So you have still, and you will find this in certain village temples still, little deities which demand animal sacrifice or some other crude forms. And you can recognize that these represent very low vital types, very low vital beings, having no spiritual value at all. But they still serve a type of human need which goes and says, I want such and such desire to be fulfilled, and I do my sacrifice and get something in return. But how long will that continue? And you see already in a large part of humanity that kind of satisfaction has been pushed out. People either go into an extreme materialism and satisfy those desires by material means, they don't need occult means, or if they turn to an inner quest, it is for something higher. But the band which is in between is becoming less and less relevant, but it's there. But under pressure of this higher ideal, it cannot survive for too long. The mother recalls visiting one of the villages near Oroville, and there was a temple there, and it was a vital being which approached her, recognizing what she represented, and made an offer. The being apparently said that if you allow, or if you give me the recognition, then I will give you something in return. And mother just refers to that in a conversation and laughs about it. But that's the kind of transactional character that those forces represent, but often with it a sophisticated ritual and even a group of people that are there to protect its needs. But today, if you look at what they practice against the general backdrop of society's values, many of those things fade. They are no more acceptable. And even the people involved have to do it in secrecy because they know it will not be acceptable. And even there have been orders passed by the legal courts of the country which do not allow animal sacrifice. So you see then these things entering in conflict because there is a higher ideal against which this is not acceptable. In Europe, something similar took place in what was generally labeled as witchcraft. A lot of good things were destroyed in the process, but a lot of low level magic was also eliminated in that. But here, it was not eliminated by order of the church or any other reference. It was eliminated by the pressure of a higher ideal or lifted under that pressure. One of the problems this offers you is the same name may be used for the deities. You'll have a little temple of Kali, you'll have a bigger temple of Kali, and you'll have a very large temple of Kali. All are Kali. But if you go there, the presence is completely different. It may even be a lower vital being masquerading under the name of Kali. Even human beings take on the name of Kali with legal documents. So the name does not make for the consciousness. But the same thing happens in these spaces also. So primitive forms not banned but put under pressure to be lifted. Even the exclusive cradle type of religion was not itself excluded, provided its affinity to the general aim and principle was clear. It was admitted into the infinite variety of the general order. So, a cradle type of religion, which is so exclusive and says this alone and not the other, and allowing for that to enter the mass of this rich play, if its general aim and principle were in alignment to the overall. So it says this alone, but this alone is your way to a spiritual transcendence. Okay, as long as you're aiming for a higher spiritual aim, it's fine. It's also part of it. And so you find even today there are certain lineages where they will initiate you, and in the initiation, they will say, you promise to not follow any other system. It's there. But this plasticity sought to support itself on a fixed religio social system, which it permeated with the principle of a graded working out of the human nature turned at its height towards a supreme spiritual endeavor. So now, here is this very plastic, free working of a religious, multifaceted religious development. A base is still needed which can hold it. We saw last time some of the underlying principles on which this was possible, the recognition that there is one truth which can be known in many ways, the principle that each one has his own approach, has his own way of knowing the truth, and therefore his own approach to the truth. These two ideas being at the root of it, still a fixed system of support developed, need not have developed, but did develop, fixed religio-social system. So there's a religious component, there's a social component, and the two blend into each other. But in this, the fixed system, there is a graded working out so that human nature is turned at its height towards a supreme spiritual endeavor. And the most practical form of it, there were several aspects to it, but the most practical form of it was what was called as the four ashramas. Now, ashrama, literally in the original sense as home, but here described as four stages of life, four phases, we may say in a more modern vocabulary. So, there is the initial ashrama where you have the brahmacharya, where you are dedicating your life to a deeper study. And today, in today's vocabulary, we would say education. Then there is the entering of the life, which is more familial life, where you have the what is the name brahmacharya and grihastha, living in the home, and so the family life comes in. And then after that, there is the vanaprastha, having completed your satisfaction of the family environment, you move into the forest life. And the fourth step is a complete renunciation, sannyas. Now, if you look at the four stages, they correspond also very naturally to a natural instinct in the human being. In your first phase, nature has embedded within you this urge to learn and to master and know everything. You don't have to do anything, the drive is there. Once that is sufficiently developed and an individuality has formed which feels itself reasonably able to navigate its world as an independent unit, the second stage nature imposes is the family unit, the forming of relationships, partnerships, families, children. But it's not just that, it is also engaging with the wider sense of family in society. Because after all, as you raise your child, you discover there are other parents facing similar problems, and then you start sharing notes, and their children become as if your children, and a kind of a social unit forms which bonds. And as you grow further, you find these units form a subgroup within society. Having been through that and all the variations of that life, you come to a stage where maybe your children are grown up, they have their own children. And suddenly you say, well, what have I been doing? What do I really want? I'm fed up with being bound in these responsibilities. I just want to be free. And at that point, you find many people choose, if they can afford it, to start going out, touring, seeing things. And often in the past, this would take the form because touring was not so easy. You could travel for weeks or months in a bullock cart. So they would go to sacred spaces and not knowing whether you would come back, because often the trip would involve half a year's journey and sometimes perilous passages into the Himalayas. So they would say goodbye to everyone as if they might not come back and go on the journey. Now, you see, psychologically, it's already recognizing the end of your family life and saying goodbye to it all. And if you do come back, what happens? You cannot re engage as you were because you already said your goodbyes. Technically, you've died, except you're still around. So that's when you are free, as if to wander in the forest. And it would take various forms. Forest at that point was not just this dense jungle full of animals. There was a lot of rich human life in the forest. The ashramas of the rishis were in the forest. So you would go there looking for deeper satisfaction. What you see today, people having reached a stage of retirement want to settle in a space which is calm or conducive to a spiritual environment and aspiration, and so on. But the sannyas comes at the last stage, and not everybody reaches that, where you say, now I want to dedicate myself into a one pointed spiritual quest. And when you enter that, that's when you renounce all else. The goal here, of course, is all else was seen as a preparation to bring you here. And as long as you were in it, well, you were kind of trapped. Now you renounce the entrapments and liberate yourself. In this frame, necessarily there was a separation of the spiritual exclusive turn from the life exclusive turn. So Sri Aurobindo points out elsewhere, one of the ways in which the society allowed for this exclusive spiritual turn and even an ascetic turn was by creating a sharp partition that you either take to worldly life or to spiritual life, but you can't be going in between. Because especially those who took to sannyas were said to be now free of all social compulsions. But such a person who is not bound to social compulsions, if he lives in society and starts teaching that freedom, it can be a bit dangerous. So they said, yes, you follow your freedom of social compulsions outside society. And so the sannyas and the spirituality associated with it was separated out, while people were here yearning towards that as a final stage, but now enjoying this. So this separation in practice was not healthy, but it was a practical term, a practical arrangement, and a fixed series of steps. So a graded working out of human nature. You see, if you go through the natural sequence, you work out all your instincts and desires, and at some point, something more essential survives, and that's all that remains. Turned at its height towards a supreme spiritual endeavor. This social fixity, which was perhaps necessary at one time for unity of life, if not also as a settled and secure basis for the spiritual freedom, has been on one side a power for preservation, but also the one obstacle to the native spirit of entire Catholicity. So interesting, it served to protect, to preserve, because it provided a structure. On the other side, it was going against this spirit of entire purity of the spiritual urge. Why? Because an element of excessive crystallization and restriction. Things have become rigid. You're forced to fit in into one of these four stages, or sometimes with it there will be other variations of life where there was the four varnas, the four broad types of psychological types of human nature. Those who turn to knowledge, those who turn to adventure, power, leadership, exercise of authority, those who turn to exchange, interchange, increase of wealth and plenitude of resources, and then those who are dedicated to work, to service, to action. So these formed four types of society. And again, it need not have been so rigidly structured, even though at first it was a psychological distinction freely chosen. In practice, what it meant was once you choose your type, you lived by its values. So a man of knowledge, seeking knowledge, must be worthy of that position or that responsibility which comes with it. And so, to ensure that the knowledge is not misused, humility is the first requirement. And pure, which is exciting, which might raise your passions and cloud the clarity of your understanding. And for purpose of humility, and so as not to find too great a pride, you will own not much wealth. You will be dependent always on others for your nourishment, for your survival. So in the extreme, it meant that the Brahmins went and begged for food, for power. They were there in the king's court offering advice, but no authority to order what they were offering as advice. he was the Kshatriya type, force of administration, adventure, authority, wielding power. But with it came the necessary support required. He's allowed to eat non vegetarian food and exciting and passionate food, having a life which involves passions, but should be willing to die to protect a higher ideal. Because his energy, his power must serve the higher truth. And so each had its support, as well as on the other side, something for which they were ready to, and higher ideal for which they were ready to lose everything. The man of business, wealth, transactions, similarly, could do everything necessary for that kind, for those values. But what does he lose in the process is that all his wealth is to be used for the furtherance of society generally. And not much is denied of him. And the fourth, of course, being somebody who serves all society with his actions, nothing is denied. He has full freedom to live as he chooses. So, with greater responsibility or with greater authority comes greater responsibility, and there was a structuring of this kind. I have perhaps shared here this story before. In the Mahabharata, there is this famous incident that four people are brought to the king's court, and they have all four committed a murder together. And the king asks his wise people, "What do we do with these four?" And of course, everybody says, "You have to give them the death penalty." And the king deliberately waits because he wants to show that Vidura is the greater of the wise men. Finally, he turns to Vidura and says, "Vidura, what is your advice?" Vidura says, "I have to meet the four. I cannot pass justice blindly." That's the concept that justice is blind. No, it is not. So the four are brought, and he asks the four, "Well, what is your psychological type?" And as it turns out, the first is a Brahmana, the second is a Kshatriya, the third is a Vaishya, and the fourth is a Shudra. The man of knowledge, man of power, man of wealth, and man of skill. So now he says, well, in that case, to the man of knowledge, you give the death penalty. To the man of power, we give imprisonment for 10 years or whatever. To the man of wealth, the state will seize all his wealth and he will be thrown out as a pauper and allowed to rebuild his life as he chooses. And the fourth, who's a man of skill, is just given a warning. Be careful of the kind of friends that you stay with. Choose your friends carefully, and with a warning, go back into life. Now, for the same crime, the four are given completely different punishments. Why? And if you go into the logic of it, the man of knowledge knew what was wrong and what was right and went against the dharma of knowledge. And such a person does not deserve to live. So, death penalty as an example for those who would misuse the knowledge. The man of power is a man of passion. He got carried away by passion and must learn to restrain his passions. And therefore, he has a period of imprisonment. What happens in imprisonment? You can't do anything and you have to learn to control yourself. The third did it out of his greed of self-benefit. And so everything is taken away. But he's allowed to rebuild his life from zero. And the fourth went without discrimination. To him, you give the warning. Now, the thinking here is, how do you assist someone to grow in consciousness? According to their type, according to their nature. So that's why he's speaking of graded working out of the human nature turned at its height towards a supreme spiritual endeavor. So this social fixity, you can see how here there is a fixity also, because your type, and you have to live by the values of your type. There's a fixity which comes into it. Necessary at one time for unity of life, if not also as a settled and secure basis for the spiritual freedom. And this was the way by which the freedom of the spirit was put in the overall framework of social and religious development. Has been on one side a power for preservation, and so as a result it lasted many thousands of years, but also the one obstacle to the native crystallization and restriction. We might say that all four impulses are within each one. Although one may predominate, a second one also develops, and a third is still developing, and a fourth undeveloped. What would be the ideal? Well, all four to be developed as far as possible and integrated. Can we do that in a single lifetime? Probably not. But recognizing this, well, follow, develop, don't limit yourself to your type, grow beyond your type, develop all four. So you would deliberately remove those restrictions, encouraging people to widen out. So he concludes, and that's the end of the paragraph. A fixed basis may be indispensable, but if settled in essence, this also must be in its forms capable of plasticity, evolutionary change. It must be an order, but a growing order. Now, this phrasing is extremely important, and we will see its implications for us in our lives. First, he says a fixed basis may be indispensable. He doesn't say is indispensable, may be indispensable. Because there are also human types who do not need that fixed basis, or even who rebel against the fixed basis, but they are relatively small in numbers. In certain spaces or at certain times, they may grow relatively more in numbers, but that's about it. So, in every society, you'll have some who rebel against that fixed basis. But otherwise, for the larger part of humanity, seems to be indispensable. You must have something on which you can build and grow. But if you accept that and it is settled, in the essence, that basis can be settled, but in the forms, it should be capable of plasticity. That means you recognize the principle, okay, there are four types in our nature. Okay, all four types are within us, but one is predominant, obviously. Now what? That recognizing the principle, the form of it should be plastic. How will you develop? According to your nature, according to your type, according to your aspiration, and perhaps even consciously trying to widen it. And in an educational system which recognizes the type, it will still use your dominant type to develop the other three types or the other three aspirations within you to be able to make for a more complete human being. So, capable of plasticity. And what is the purpose of the plasticity? Evolutionary change. You're not here to be plastic simply to adapt to swinging circumstances and the moods and the current fashionable trends. It must have an evolutionary plasticity. As you grow, the forms should be able to adapt. Now, in the space of education, one way in which the mother put this into practice was that in a classroom, every child is allowed to grow according to their current interest. And especially for younger children, you have a whole spread of different activities. Do what you like, play. I remember we were at the age of perhaps 7 or 8, and the teacher would come. They had little, they called it pockets. They had a little bag into which they would put the toys that we would play with. And the teacher would come to us and say, "What do you want for next week?" And I thought it always didn't make sense to me. Now, as looking back as an adult, I can say, for us, next week was not real enough. We could not choose what my desire will be like next year. We were too young for that. Next week, we were too young for that. As an adult, I can say, okay, now I've had enough of this last 1 week. Next week, I want to do something different. But as a child, a week is still too far away. Even tomorrow may be too far away. The instinct is, what do I want now? And so the proper way would have been to make everything available and let the child freely take, which is what we also got in a different class at the age of 10, 11, 12 with a different teacher. But in that, we played, and after a while, we saw someone else playing something which was more interesting. We shifted to that, and the interest led through levels of complexity and difficulty, navigating what would be otherwise chaotic path. But at each time, the mind turning to what was most interesting, representing the need of development there. And in a very short time, you've created a very rich, multifaceted base of skills. So the plasticity for evolutionary change. So, in form, it should be capable of plasticity, even if the base is somewhat settled in essence. It must be an order, but a growing order. Now, this is the challenge here. Can you create an order, an organization, a structure, a framework which is growing in evolutionary terms, but in growing, it should be able to exceed its own limits as necessary, when necessary? And you will see the form it took with the mothers working was when a child did not fit in into the existing thing, and the child says, I want to do this, she would say, all right. And he would be one exception. And I remember it happened with me. This was with a teacher who was exceptional. And this is the one who actually gave us the best experience of how integral education is to be practiced. Her name was Amita Sen. And so we were in this class, we had fixed classes, we had this free space. And three of us went to her and said, downstairs in that room, they're showing a movie, videos, and we want to go and see. Now, she did not have the benefit or the convenience, the advantage for the entire class to watch. She allowed three of us to go. And I don't know how she applied that discrimination. It was certainly from a very objective position of today, where each one should have the same facility. She allowed these three. Today, looking back, I can see all three deserved it. There was a level of inquisitiveness developed in these three that needed that. And she allowed for that exception, but she put one condition. She said, every time you've seen that, you must come back and write what you saw. And I don't care what you write, how long it is, but write what you saw, share it with me, share it with others. And so we did that, but we did it almost in a haphazard way, somehow trying to fit the requirement, but not really seriously. Looking back, we could have made better use of it. But that level of flexibility was available, and it was not really arbitrary. There was a deeper wisdom behind, but a system which allowed that. Later on, at some stage, when I was perhaps 15 or 16, I had got into some exploration of mathematics, and I said, I need to understand what are tensors. Now, in pure maths, this was like 5 years ahead of my class. And I wanted to understand this. And I began to look up books, and there were things which I couldn't follow. And there was a professor of maths. He was, in his earlier phase of life, head of Department of Mathematics in Madurai University. Now, that's really, really big. He is like national level professor of professors. And after his retirement, he was living in the ashram. Well, he had been coming for many years, but he settled here and he was teaching in the school. This man accepted to sit with me every week, 2 or 3 periods, one-on-one, alone, one teacher to one student, with a 15-year-old, to teach and explain tensors and some higher mathematical concepts. And he stayed like that with me for 4 or 5 years. And many interesting things which he gave, and in a way that no other maths teacher was capable of giving, but which my mind at 15 was still struggling to keep with. But it was possible. The system allowed that. You would not see that happen in a conventional school. You may not even see that happen in today's environment in the same school, because things have become more rigid. And Sri Aurobindo's observation that the sign of an institutional decline is increase in rigidity. The moment someone comes and says, oh, but I am aged, I can't walk from here to there, can you open this little gate for me to pass through? No, everybody has to go all around. You see that often at the gates. The gatekeepers tend to be like that. That's your institutional rigidity. You can see the person cannot do it. What about a little bit of compassion? No, it's the rule. And often now the excuse is, I'm being watched, my boss will blame me. My boss will punish me if I don't follow the rule. And that means rigidity has started at the top and is percolating down. And the ideal circumstance would be where the boss says, look, this is how we want ideally, but you should be able to make exceptions. Use your intelligence, right? If there is flexibility at the top, it can also percolate down. So this evolutionary change, starting with an order, but an order which is growing. And I said this is extremely important, and in our individual life. In our individual life, also, we need order, we need structure, we need certain forms which can support, direct, and even contain our spiritual aspiration. Who take that form to an extreme. I wake up at 4 o'clock morning, whether I'm sleepy or not, whether I've had enough sleep or not, I force myself to wake up and sit for 1 hour of intense, whatever practice I have to do, my japa, my prayer, my meditation. I'm struggling with sleep, perhaps, but that's my discipline. And I suppose at a certain stage, it's extremely valuable. But at another stage, you may realize if you're struggling with sleep, and your biology is giving way, then at least at this age, you should give more importance to the sleep, and the time is not critical. When you wake up, when you're fresh, you do what you want because that is more valuable. But that flexibility we should be able to have in our own life, recognizing what is the essence which is settled. The settled essence is that I need to be able to direct, when fresh, all of my parts of my mind and emotions and will in a one pointed aspiration. For how long? As much as you're able to hold in a meaningful way. At what time? When you're most fresh. So, very flexible already. In what way, in what manner you will do what works best for you. But the principle, the essence is still retained. And that in what manner works best for me, sometimes it helps that I go all the way to the sacred space, sit at the ashram, do it there. At other times, I'm sitting at home and it's perhaps more appropriate, more helpful. Or I go to the beach and watch the sunrise, and a certain phase of my life that becomes important. Or at another time, I wish to sit with a group of people and do it together. Does not matter. See, any of these could have been made into a rule and regulation. And if at a particular stage in the ashram life, the mother did it that way, then everybody would say, that's how mother taught us. So we stay stuck because that's the rule she gave. And so the mother was very careful not to allow forms to get codified in this way, allowing a full plasticity of forms. There's even a very interesting discussion where she says this openly. She says, not everybody in the ashram is asked to meditate. And so somebody asks, why? Well, she says there are certain types who are able to do that, others are not able to do that or don't need it. They do it in another way, through work or through their devotion. And because that was there, in form you had people meditating and people not meditating. What happened in practice was those who grew up not meditating took that as their form, and that became their rigid form. Oh, all this meditation is not necessary. Do your work and the rest will happen. No, that's not how it is. But that rigidity on one extreme could be compared with someone else who would take rigidity on the other extreme. The point is, none of that rigidity is helpful. The principle, the essence, with the plasticity of evolutionary change and growing order. So now we take this to a collective space. What happens in collective life, of course, we have to have fixed timings. For a lunch, for example, if you have a community kitchen, you can't have the kitchen open 24 hours. So there have to be fixed timings. You can't keep the food hot all the time just because of one or two exceptions. So what happens in practice? You have a fixed time. Everyone adjusts to the time, but the time itself may be long enough to allow for certain adaptability. And yet, in the ashram life, there were people who during the lunch hour had their duty and would get free of their duty only half an hour later after the lunch closes. And so for them, an arrangement is made that someone takes the food for them, keeps it carefully in one corner in the dining room. The person comes after the dining room has officially closed and gets his lunch anyway. Or for others who are too aged to come, an arrangement is made for the food to be sent home. And all of the flexible possibilities are there as long as there is the goodwill among the people. If we recognize each other's needs, we are there to help each other. When the goodwill is reduced, that's when the rigidities tend to form. But in this growing order, there are other variations the mother allowed. There are some who said, we can't eat the food in the dining room. All right, so a separate section was there for the children and the community kitchen for children, where even meat was there. And then there were those who said, we would rather cook at home because this does not suit us. So a facility is provided for people to have to receive wood to burn in those days because you didn't have gas, to burn a fire and to cook at home, and vegetables given so that you can cook in your own way. Now think about how complex this becomes in a community of 500 or 1,000 people, already so many exceptions and variations, all accepted by the mother. For what? After all this is given to you, can you please take advantage of the opportunity for your spiritual growth? And if that is missed, then the point of this is lost. But growing order meant the order itself was flexible and adaptive. When you look at the township of Oroville, when mother started it, her explicit guidance of she gave all these essential principles, and her explicit guidance on forms was that forms of governance should evolve according to the consciousness of the people and the need of the people. Forms of financial exchange, again, to evolve. Eventually, she said, no money. In the beginning, in certain spaces, you can do without money. Another space is difficult or too difficult. So she said, yes, in between, you have a mixed mode. You'll have money exchange also, but with that aim. So you have this reference always, knowing that this is not possible to change now. You have a reference, and there's always a pressure of this reference. Some say, oh, that's impractical. Mother was speaking of ideals. We have to be practical and just knock out the ideal. A lot of administrators in Oroville have taken that position to the detriment. And then there are others who keep saying, yes, but how can we change this to adapt to that? And they were often the ones who made breakthroughs and new systems or new structures evolving. In one of the presentations regarding Oroville outside India, so some of the members from Oroville said something like, oh, we are a work in progress. We are not perfect. We are nowhere there. We are work in progress. And I took that opportunity to say, you know what? That's not a crime. That's not an error. It's in the design of Oroville that systems created will be evolving. So you need not be apologetic when you say we are work in progress. The idea implied is at some point we will get there and then we will have it, the system. No, it's not that. Systems are only useful as long as they serve the purpose of the community. And if they don't, then they change. What is the purpose? That's what we have to look at and then make a framework that works. And then when that framework doesn't work, adapt it to what is necessary. If you start thinking in those terms, you have an order, but a growing order. And the order grows not only according to the needs of the people, but also according to the complexity of the community. So when the ashram was, let's say, 50 people, it was far more easy to be flexible. When the ashram becomes 1,000 people, flexibility will reduce. But then, as long as that goodwill is there, we will find ways. So I'm reading this text not only in the context of the way the religious forms evolved as a container for the spiritual aspiration, but this is true of every such structure, socio-religious structure, which we may have as a container for the spiritual aspiration in our communities. So now the next paragraph, he elaborates on this and shows you the benefits as well as the difficulties which come with this. Nevertheless, the principle of this great and many-sided religious and spiritual evolution was sound. And by taking up in itself the whole of life and of human nature, by encouraging the growth of intellect and never opposing it or putting bounds to its freedom, but rather calling it in to the aid of the spiritual seeking, it prevented the conflict or the undue predominance which in the Occident led to the restriction and the drying up of the religious instinct and the plunge into pure materialism and secularism. The whole of life is taken up, the whole of human nature is taken up, encouraging the growth of the intellect not putting restriction on it, allowing it its freedom, rather calling it to the aid of the spiritual. Now you have not cut out the intellect. What happened in the Occident was that the intellect was separated as something which is always doubting, which is the cause of problems, which is contrary to the religious faith, which must become blind belief and cannot be reasoned out. There was this collision, conflict, and the division that took place in the Protestant form, and with it, of course, the exaggeration of pure materialism or secularism, where the religious experience is separated from daily life. And with that, the separation again of the truth of religion, which was meant to transform life. So you had people who took to the religious life, and then the secular laity who turned to religion only as a support or for a protection from some guilt, and that's about it. Both of these distortions were avoided by including the intellect in the spiritual seeking. So, this is something which we have to become very conscious of. Whenever we feel a conflict in understanding and in the aspiration, rather than saying, oh, this is coming in the way, remove it, you have to find a way to harmonize and use the understanding to assist the aspiration. I'm surprised even today we meet people here who will say things like, oh, that's too mental. My mind is coming in the way, I have to learn to remove it. And that's always a recipe for a disaster later on. Because at some point, this mind is going to say, you have neglected me too much, my doubt needs to be satisfied. And it will come back with a vengeance of doubt. Instead of separating, instead of suppressing, we have to say, I need to understand where this is leading, or what is the context in which I can understand this movement or this impulse or this aspiration. And the advantage we have is that Sri Aurobindo presents always in rational terms. There are writings of Sri Aurobindo where he does not bother with the explanations. He says, this is how it is. Well, put it into practice, go ahead. And then in most of his later writings, he has taken trouble and he explains why. He says the modern mind is a rational mind and it has to be addressed through or in a framework which is rational. It doesn't mean reason is used to prove or justify spiritual truths, because it cannot. But reason is used to give a framework in which you understand the spiritual domain and experience. And that can be done. So, whenever you feel this conflict, do not set aside the intellect, rather include it. And if from the beginning this has been done, the intellect itself now, under the influence of the spirit, tends to become more sensitive, more refined, and even more intuitive. In the intellect, one feels the way you would feel with the heart. What is right? Is this right or is that right? But in the mind, you think which feels right as an idea. And the same discrimination which is felt in the heart can fill the mind also. And you'll feel an idea and lifting, a refinement, and even a transformation eventually. This is what has been one of the biggest failures I find in many of the families of devotees. And I've mentioned this before, but in this context, we'll see it differently. Many of the devotees who came to the mother, having met the mother, having had a deep experience, or having had a certain awakening within, lived that aspiration in their lives. They had families, they had children, but we find after their passing or even during their lifetime, the children did not catch it. You don't do that, which is the best way for a young child to feel suppressed and to eventually. Or it was not transmitted in a way that was felt as a living experience. And in particular, it did not meet the criteria of reason. I don't know why, but I don't understand, and my understanding, and often coming with education, makes me question and doubt. Now, there are children who have grown up with a very Marxist thinking, even in India, religion as the drug of the masses. It's not always said in that way, but the thought being there in those who wrote the textbooks. It was under Nehru, the whole of the educational department was put under control of Marxists and leftists, and the entire textbooks were written by them to completely cut off the children from the traditions and the deeper values, and in the process, exaggerating this intellect in opposition to deeper and spiritual values. And the intellect, for many of them, became an end in itself, but without meaning. The result was their questioning. And so the training has been like this, they're questioning, they poo-poo religion. And then there's a whole training which associates religion with fraudulence. In our own school, in my own class, and this is now going back 30 years, at the end of the year, we have completed the equivalent of college, and there's a program to be performed. And we were discussing, what do we do? It's an attempt at creativity. Everyone tries to be as creative as they can and to get laughs or to entertain others who come. And very strong impulse of a group, of my age group, that said, let's do a skit on fake sadhus. Why fake sadhus? Because cinema always showed sadhus or religious people as fake, as pretentious, as fooling society, taking advantage of them. And that came from the leftist programming. And here are children who have grown up in the ashram school in a spiritual atmosphere with supposedly having imbibed spiritual values, and that's all they can think of as the best of their creativity. And they did it, and nobody stopped them. People watched, teachers watched, and nobody asked the question where we went wrong as teachers. It did happen at some stage that, and it was in the year just after I had completed, so 1990 or something. And one of the teachers told me this later. There was a meeting of the teachers, and this teacher raised the question, if out of 22 or 24 children completing education in the ashram school per year, only 1 or 2 join the ashram and the rest of them leave, and often for good, there must be something wrong that we are doing. And he said there was a stunned silence, and the other teachers refused to discuss, and they stopped looking at him, stopped talking to him, and that was it. And it's a kind of a refusal to face an uncomfortable truth. But these things should be questioned. And if we recognize that something is wrong, then we have to see what we did wrong. And I can look back and say, yes, there was too much of preaching. There were teachers who would simply preach without any useful value, any useful content. I remember at the age of 15, 16, we would be telling, as a group, we would be telling our teachers, we want to read Sri Aurobindo. Give us something. No, Sri Aurobindo is too difficult, too vast, beyond your capacity. You will study him once you reach the college level. Duh. And that's all. Of course, by that time, you're formed and the interest is not the same. And the way it's taught there is also perhaps not so good. But I'm saying if it could be like this here, what happens in a family where you're raising children, even with a society that's putting the opposite values, and you are unable to transmit because in your own consciousness, the spiritual and the intellectual have not unified. And how then do you transmit it to them? And they need that more than anything else. I perhaps shared this before, but I'll repeat it because I'm not sure if I shared it here. I had gone to a school in Bangalore, and the topic I had given was Science of Indian Rituals. We had about 1,000 children. And for an hour, I spoke of various rituals which are there in the Indian traditions, and which, of course, are unexplained. Well, why do you do namaste? Why do you light a fire? You make an arati which is clockwise and not anti-clockwise? Or why is it that you drink during an eclipse, etc.? So a whole spectrum of things. And each I went to the deeper, either physical science behind it, or its symbolism, or its occult science, and the spiritual content, whatever. So we went through the whole thing for about an hour or so, and then there was a question-answer session, which was planned to be at most 15 or 20 minutes, which went on for a whole hour more. A lot of enthusiasm. There were many more questions. We had to stop because they had to go for classes. And a week later, I get a call from the principal of the school. And she says, parents are calling us about your talk. I said, oh my God, what happened? Did I say something which has caused trouble? She said, no. The parents are now calling to say, earlier we would try to teach the children. Now the children are teaching us how to do it the right way. And I said, that's success. Because it was addressed to them in a reasonable, understandable way that made sense and touched some deeper resonance. And so now they are eager to put it into practice. When people say children are not interested, I'll say, no, that's not true. You're approaching them the wrong way. They are interested. You have to approach it the right way. And one of the biggest problems is how you bridge the intellect with this deeper experience or knowledge or even ritual form. And the modern mind being intellectual, you have to be able to bridge this. Without it, there will always be this reaction and the division, either of pure materialism or a secularism, which is what you see in a lot of children when the intellect has not been addressed. Either they just say, all that I don't believe, or they say, all that I will do once I retire. Now I need to enjoy life and I'm not spiritual. So what you see here, although put in a historical context of the develops individually in our children and the collective around, one of the problems we face in the ashram, for example, is so much of the collective life is still at a sentimental level. We sit together to meditate, we have a meditation, or we sit together for programs, but we do not have a collective life in which the intellect is engaged. And so the intellect is missing entirely from the community life in the ashram. In Auroville, it is much more flexible because there are multiple spaces which can emerge as necessary, and so many of these needs are met. But if you translate this in a much smaller community of a center in a city, so in Bombay there are 3 or 4 centers, some places people spontaneously gather in a study circle. Depending on the need of the group, you may or may not have a requirement for the intellectual satisfaction. So the whole group may be more devotionally oriented and they're happy with the devotional interchange. Wonderful. But if the group has an intellectual need, we have to address it. What happens is a group forms which is primarily devotional. Someone comes with an intellectual need, finds him not fitting, goes away. But can we have groups which are also addressing that need much more? Or within a single group to address multiple needs in a single session. So we can create a form of a gathering. Let's say we have weekly meetings, a study circle, and can we make a form, a structure, an order, but which is flexible, which is evolutionary, and which can grow according to the group's need, which means we start with whatever structure we have and then we modify it to adjust to the need of those who are here. And we should be able to recognize what our need is. Just because I don't feel myself satisfied, I stop coming and just fades out. Rather, I should be able to say, I need more of this. I need to understand more. I need to share more. I need to hear whatever the thing is. And then let's adapt. Let's see. Know that you have to be able to restructure your own order as necessary as you grow. So, it calling in the aid of the intellect for the spiritual seeking, it prevented the conflict or the undue predominance, which can lead to this drying up of the religious instinct or the plunge in secularism. A method of this plastic and universal kind, these are 2 key words, plasticity and universality. Plasticity is not enough. You may still be too narrow. Universality is not enough because it may still be too rigid. So you go to into spaces like this where all the symbols of all the religions are placed on the walls of that space. But what you follow as a practice is fixed in its structure, does not have plasticity. You seem to represent all these different views or philosophies or religions, but too rigid still, not enough fluidity. So both these, plastic and universal kind, a method admitting but exceeding all creeds and forms. So you admit all the creeds and forms into this method, but you have to exceed them, allowing every kind of element may have numerous consequences which might be objected to by the purist. So, here in the Indian space, looking at now the historical context, it has allowed all this. Every form was allowed, every element, but exceeding always in the overall term. So, may have numerous consequences which might be objected to by the purist. So, what would be some of the consequences which I discussed earlier? Which is legitimate? How do I know which is genuine or which is pretentious, which is shallow, which is deep? Well, there are other problems. It's too confused, too chaotic, too unstructured, too free. I need something narrow. And of course, you will find your own narrow way. And if someone comes and says, all this is not organized enough, and I will now organize, well, he's still allowed his organization. And the larger plastic system adapts to that need for organization, or to, if the organization is too rigid, it simply fails. I'll give an example here. It happened in the last 15 years in India. We have so many lineages, orthodox lineages. You know, those people will wear their dresses, have their fixed teachings, and have schools, entire families dedicated to them. In a matter, it is called, which is like a order. They'll have their staff and their rights and authorities and their own hierarchies within the order and across orders. That order is bigger. This is whatever. So they never work together. And finally, it was recognized that this is to the detriment of the general society and the general spiritual values of the Hindu tradition. And so one of the very senior members of one of these lineages said, let's bring it all together. So he did that. He spoke, he went and met each one of them. This is fascinating for the exercise, and it shows you what can happen. He met each of them, convinced each one, yes, we had to come together. Then there was a complex selection of dates and times when everyone could come together. It's an achievement in itself. And I believe they had 108 of these leaders. They all come into one hall for the first time in several thousand years. Many of them won't speak to each other, won't look at each other, will despise each other. And now they were all in the same hall. What an achievement. But the complexities involved, as I heard from some of the organizers, this person has to be on a higher pedestal than the other. He's wearing ochre robes. He's supposed to be a sannyasi. A higher pedestal. I recently met another sannyasi in an order, and I said, somebody is going to come who's a guest, and he's also a spiritual teacher. And immediately says, is he white robed or orange robed? So I said, why is she asking? I said, okay, he's white robed. Okay, if he's orange robed, then I have to do namaste first. If he's white robed, then he has to do namaste first. Oh, I see. I didn't know you had hierarchies. Okay. But so you have these 108 with all their problems. I have to speak first before that person can speak, and all their big egos so loud that it was the biggest problem. And this man who brought them all together had to set the example by being the most humble. So what he did, it's amazing skill. He gave each of them their chance, managed to get them all to speak. And at the end of that, he said, look, we have all come as heads of our institutions. Now let's just meet as human beings. So he got down from his chair and sat down in the well of that room. And one by one, all the others came down together and met. Okay, huge achievement. What came of it? So they decided they're going to make a statement. So a statement was announced, common statement. Then we will meet next year and make statements every year. Like the Pope passes his orders. So now you have all the major leaders of Hindu society. Except, do they really represent society? That's a different question. Okay, so they're the most orthodox lineages. So they met a couple of times and then the whole thing fell apart. And eventually they couldn't meet. Nothing was happening. Or if it happened, we never heard about it. It was too difficult to bring them together and it's led to nothing. They were just not interested in engaging with others or in larger society, stuck in their own narrow lineages. Then this man had the idea. Now we look at all the new lineages, which are not the orthodox ones, and there are many more, and they have larger followings. Let's bring them together in one platform. It never happened, as far as I'm aware, it never happened. But this is the problem. You can say we will organize, and they will all say, yes, wonderful, go ahead and organize, but they just don't engage because they're free to engage or not. So in practice, it has great strength because of flexibility, but it has great weakness because of too great a flexibility or too decentralized in order. There's no coherent response on political issues. For example, the church gives an order, everybody vote for so and so, all the followers follow. There's nothing like that in the general Hindu space. You cannot do it. And even they end up contradicting each other. So they don't have any political force or political voice, which is a strength, you may say, or a weakness in a different context. So this is what he describes. What's the consequence? Numerous consequences. But its great justifying result has been an unexampled multitudinous richness. So multifaceted and rich. But not just that, and a more than millennial persistence and impregnable durability, generality, universality, height, subtlety, and endeavor. Now, all these are unparalleled on this scale with this richness anywhere in human history. So, what are the things? More than millennial persistence. And the tradition itself, interestingly, never called itself Hindu, by the way. Historically, the word Hindu is the name given by the Persians to the people of India. And it was a distortion of Sindhu river, Sapta Sindhus, the land of seven rivers, became Hapta Hindu in their pronunciation. And so the Arabs beyond the Persians heard from the Persians the Hindu lands or the Hindu space, and they named this space Hindu, or the traditions, the cultures, the ethnic types. It's not defined. That's the problem. So whenever I was recently in a meeting of Hindu identity. And what do you mean by Hindu? And the moment you define an identity, you know you've lost it. You can't say it's ethnic identity. No, it doesn't work anymore. Ethnic identities don't have the religious values. You can't define it as a religious value because there are those who do not practice the religion but have deeper spiritual values. And the tradition itself is more than the religion. You can speak of it in spiritual terms. You can speak of it as a political space. None of them in itself defines. All of these together makes it too much of an amalgam to say anything definite. And yet that's how it is. And so that is its strength, but its weakness. So multitudinous richness, more than a millennial persistence. So I said it's not the term used. What is the term used? It called itself Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana meaning eternal, and Dharma meaning the upholding truth, which makes for us to be, or our deepest sense of purpose, which makes us bow west. Now, if you make that your reference, inherent to this pursuit is the sense of the eternity, but also inherent is the plasticity that allows it to be also eternal, which is why you will see most of the ancient, in fact, all of the ancient civilizations have died out. Nothing survives except this one, what we call the Hindu tradition, but it never called itself that because its sense was the pursuit of eternity. So, more than millennial persistence and impregnable durability. It has survived, and it's the only space where Islam came to convert and failed, Christianity came to convert and had a rule. Islam had 800 years rule, Christianity had 200 years rule and failed to convert. Of course, they converted patches, but the overall space did not lose. And it was one of the problems. There's a very interesting article written by one of the Christian priests at the time under British colonial rule. And he describes the strength of the civilization, its resistance to conversion, being in its multifaceted pieces separated out and develop their own identities. You could never catch one center and convert the whole. Catch the king and you convert the whole kingdom, but it doesn't work. In fact, this is the problem. Sri Aurobindo later uses the phrase, since we won't meet it now, I will read ahead. At the end of the paragraph, he describes this as a religion which is itself a congeries of religions, and which at the same time provides each man with his own turn of inner experience, would be the most in consonance with this purpose of nature. So, religion which is itself a combination of so many different religions, and that's how we have to see it. So, I remember meeting a professor of religious studies in Geneva, one of the universities in Geneva, and she specialized in, of course, many traditions. And in her view, she described how every culture or nation had at its base a certain religious tradition or history. And she was describing her story. She herself came from a particular community, the one which the Turkish had destroyed, which is that one of the Christian, no, there's a Christian subgroup. Anyway, so she was part of that. And then she said, but India, oh my God, it's too much. I cannot understand. So many religions. And she couldn't understand how so many religions could make for one India. And it was interesting to see how the whole thinking had been the religion defines the identity of the people. And here you had so many religions and overlapping each other, and sometimes people belonging to multiple groups, and still the whole thing holds together, and it was impossible. And there are similar observations from the attempt to convert. So this impregnable durability against every attempt to break. And the last is, of course, what we are facing today, which is the assault of an extreme materialism and secularism, which still has not been able to destroy. And out of that, something will come out even stronger, because it will incorporate the truth of the materialism and the secularism and rebuild itself. But of course, many things are lost in the process. It doesn't mean that everything survives. And this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. In the nature of the present transition, not just in India, now all over the world, everything which can recover its deeper truth will survive, either in its same form or in a new form. And everything which cannot find a deeper truth will, of course, break apart. And that's the nature of the evolutionary change. So what spiritual root could not survive anyway. But with that, a lot of skilled knowledge has also been lost. In the traditions, there were many medical lineages which held preserved medical traditions, many arts, many sciences, and the knowledge of that also has been destroyed with the breakdown of the traditions. But I look at it this way. From a spiritual perspective, one can always recover, because the source of that knowledge is still there. Even one may say the force of the tradition which held, to the extent that it is still there as a spiritual force, can be accessed and given a new form, or the specifics of the knowledge can be recast in new forms. So, impregnable durability, generality, it is so general you cannot define it. And universality, because all perspectives are included. Height, and there were centers at least aiming at the highest of heights, including the most extreme transcendences, and then subtlety and many-sided wideness of spiritual attainment and seeking and endeavor. So, attainment, seeking, endeavor. You will see endeavor is how we begin. Seeking is the form that it takes, which leads to the attainment. And so he's covering a whole spectrum. Each of these one could pause and appreciate what these represent. But it's as if he's capturing the full spectrum of this. It is indeed only by such a catholicity and plasticity that the wider aim of the evolution can work itself out with any fullness. So, this has to be our reference in our spiritual communities. Now, if our community was 20 people or 50 people, well, you don't need much diversity, much plasticity, because how much variety will you have? But when numbers grow, you have 1,000 people, Oroville is meant to grow into a 50,000 community, or even if you say, look at something closer like 10,000 or 20,000, you can see the varieties of human types, needs, aspirations, endeavors, and obviously a multifacetedness of this kind, a many-sided wideness, plasticity can only serve this evolutionary aim. And so we have to keep this at the back of the mind, allowing for that plasticity. One of the extraordinary gifts of Professor Kirit Joshi was that he drafted the act under which Oroville is recognized by the central government of. He drafted the act. Initially, it had been drafted by a bureaucrat, and it would have been, he said, a disaster for Oroville. And the night before it was to be tabled in Parliament, the Prime Minister gives him a copy of the act and says, take a look at it. And he goes through at night and he sees it's a disaster, and he writes out the new act as it should be. And the Prime Minister of India says, yes, okay, this is what we will table in Parliament. Imagine the divine grace involved in this. And what that does is it puts the entire governance of Oroville in the hands of Orovillians. The Indian government is there to give money. It's enough. That's a different story. But that it does this. And nowhere in human history has a government of a nation given a subgroup of people, not just its own citizens, but citizens from all over the world, and full power of government to back this effort. Special category of visas. There is something called Oroville visa, which bypasses all the other visa restrictions and procedures available for all citizens of any other country. But for Oroville, can you believe a government going to that extent to support the freedom of a people to pursue spiritual effort? And one of Mother's observations about Oroville was it could only happen in India. And that's why it had to be done here. And it is because of this background of that spiritual foundation of the civilization. And the government can accept to do this and even protect the value of this. It's unheard of. But just that itself is your template for human unity. If this can happen here, it can happen anywhere and in a larger scale. So now he comes to one, and we'll end with this, a very important reversal. So far, we have been seeing what religion is doing. Now we reverse this. What is the individual seeking from religion, and what is nature seeking through this? And so this picture shifts. The individual demands from religion a door of opening into spiritual experience, or a means of turning towards it, a communion with God, or a definite light of guidance on the way, a promise of the hereafter, or a means of a higher supra-terrestrial future. This is what the individual asks. These needs can be met on the narrower basis of creedal belief and sectarian cult. All this could have been addressed by something very narrow. But comes the other thing, the other side. But there is also the wider purpose of nature to prepare and further the spiritual evolution in man and turn him into a spiritual being. So it's not, religion is sitting in between the individual need and nature's need. Religion was the vehicle. It's not an end in itself. So, what the individual asks, religion can fulfill in limited ways. But what nature asks is more than this vehicle could fulfill, or more than what the individual asks. And that is what matters finally. What that is and the whole scope of this we will take up in detail next time. But just to read the sentence. So, nature wants to turn man into a spiritual being. Religion serves her as a means for pointing his effort and his ideal in that direction, and providing each one who is ready with the possibility of taking a step upon the way towards it. This end she serves by the immense variety of the cults she has created. Now we again get back the real picture. So far we thought human beings were doing all this. No, no, she is doing this. She builds these. And that's why even when you look at a monolith like the Catholic Church, within the church you will find subgroups and cults and varieties and variations inevitably, because it is nature's intention. Some final, standardized, and definitive, others more plastic, various, many sided. And finally, he says, what is nature's way? A religion which is itself a congeries of religions, and which at the same time provides each man with his own turn of inner experience, would be in consonance with this purpose of nature. So she wants this many religions within this larger movement of religion. And so nature's purpose, individual purpose, and the religion in between as the vehicle to fulfill both. And that's the complex, let's say, dynamics of this whole effort. So we'll review this in detail next time, which will be after a gap of 2 weeks. I will hopefully be out of station unless the coronavirus cancels flights. But so the plan is at least that we will resume our classes from 3rd of April, which is a Friday in Savitri Bhavan, and 5th of April, which is the Sunday here. But in case the things change and I'm not able to go, then do check sometime next week. I'm supposed to go out of the country. So, no, there's not that I'm aware of. But you never know; things are changing day to day. So just check in case, yeah, so that. Yes. Okay. So the best way would be you give your email address to Joel, and he will put out an email, and the decision will be clear by Thursday. I'm supposed to leave on Thursday, so okay, that's it. So we pause here and review the implications of this for ourselves individually and for the community in which we live, or the society in which we live. And some not be just the people around us, but the people we are linked to, and to recognize the rich and wide movement of nature working through this variety. And so our own Catholicity and universality and plasticity, which is required to be a conscious part of this upward ascent. We can meditate on this for half a minute.